We would like to continue with our next keynote lecture number 4, which is entitled Towards a Disaster Resilient Sustainable Development, the Importance of DRR in the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015. And it is my particular pleasure to welcome very warmly here in Davos Ambassador Michael Gerber. Ambassador Gerber is the special representative of the Swiss government for global sustainable development, and he is with the Swiss Development and Cooperation Agency, SDC, in Bern. He leads Switzerland's engagement in the international process of the post-2015 UN Development Agenda, and Sustainable Development Goals are, of course, the key issue of this process. And he is the Swiss chief negotiator. In his function, he also leads the national consultation in view of a new global framework on sustainable development and heads Switzerland's interministerial task force as well as SDC's core team on the succession of the Millennium Development Goals. May I ask Ambassador Gerber to join the floor? Thank you. The floor is yours, Ambassador Gerber.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to be here today, and I thank the organizers, the GRF Davos and Walter Ammann in particular, for their invitation to this beautiful place. Usually it's warmer this time in the year, but in this case there are no windows in this room, so it's no disappointment that you don't have to look outside, since the weather is bad anyway. But it's great to be here in this, I'm sure, also disaster-resilient building in Davos, and I'm very glad to report a little bit about this process that Walter Ammann just mentioned, the post-2015 Development Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. At this moment, the international community has an unprecedented opportunity to ensure a disaster resilient, sustainable development. Next year, 3 important global conferences will take place. In March, heads of state will meet in Sendai, Japan, to adopt the successor of the Hyogo Framework for Action, which provides the follow-up framework for disaster risk reduction after 2015. In September 2015, a summit in New York will take place to adopt a new framework for sustainable development, the so-called post-2015 Development Agenda, which will replace the Millennium Development Goals, the Mdgs. And besides that, it will also integrate the Rio Agenda on Sustainable Development. I will come back to this. And finally, in December, a new framework on climate change is expected to be adopted in Paris under the UNFCCC. These 3 frameworks, although different in nature, are all closely related to each other and to the issue of disaster risk reduction. So I'm very pleased to be here today in my capacity as Special Envoy of Switzerland for Global Sustainable Development and shed some light on the second framework I just mentioned, the post-2015 Development Agenda, with the Sustainable Development Goals, or short SDGs, at its core. So to negotiate on behalf of Switzerland, at the United Nations, the definition of a new set of SDGs is currently my main task, as Mr. Ammann already mentioned. So in the next few minutes, I would like to highlight the importance of disaster resilience for the Sustainable Development Goals and subsequently address the interlinkages with the successor of the Hyogo Framework for Action. What are the SDGs? Some of you might remember. In September 2000, at the turn of the millennium, the largest gathering of world leaders in history adopted the UN Millennium Declaration. In this declaration, they committed their nations to a new global partnership to reduce extreme poverty. 1 year later, based on this declaration, the United Nations defined 8 goals to be achieved by 2015, the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. The MDGs are time-bound and quantified goals for addressing extreme poverty in its many dimensions, including income poverty, hunger, disease, lack of adequate shelter, and exclusion, all while promoting gender equality, education, and environmental sustainability. The MDGs have demonstrated the value of translating a shared vision on development into concrete, time-bound global goals. They put the focus on key challenges and have mobilized resources and global action from the development community and beyond. 1 year before their deadline, broad progress can be reported. The target of reducing extreme poverty by half has been reached. Extreme poverty in terms of income, defined proportion of people living with less than $1.25 per day. This proportion of extreme poverty fell from over 47% of the population in developing countries by the time 2 billion in 1990 to less than 22%, but still 1.2 billion people in 2010. Since 2010, income poverty has been decreasing in every developing region, including the sub-Saharan Africa, where rates are still highest. Progress has also been achieved in many other areas, including gender equality, education, and health. But despite remarkable results achieved in numerous respects, the MDG framework has also several shortcomings, of course. Although MDG 7, environmental sustainability, the environmental dimension was not adequately treated. The strong focus of the MDGs on social development ignores the interrelation between social and economic development and environmental sustainability. Although poverty was substantially reduced in the last 2 decades, the eradication of poverty cannot be achieved if we do not take into account the social, the economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development. In parallel, a lot of momentum is gathering in the lead up to the Rio +20 UN conference on sustainable development in June 2012. These are the results that I just mentioned. Sorry. In Rio, it was decided that the world needs global sustainable development goals to mobilize global action. Given the many interlinkages between the issues, it was decided to have a single overarching framework with a single set of goals to tackle poverty eradication and sustainable development in all its dimensions for the period following 2015. The new framework will involve a paradigm shift in our understanding of development, I believe, in at least 3 ways. First, a holistic understanding of development should go beyond poverty eradication and combine social and economic development with environmental sustainability. In addition, issues of governance, rule of law, and peaceful societies should also be addressed, as evidence has shown that without peace and governance, sustainable development is not possible. Perhaps even more significantly, a further element of this paradigm shift is the universality of this new framework. The post-2015 Agenda on Sustainable Development will address global challenges which require not only the collaboration of all countries, but also action within all countries, in accordance with national circumstances, of course. These two aspects of the needed paradigm shift imply, thirdly, new forms of cooperation and partnerships, going beyond traditional development cooperation, breaking the classical north-south divide or the pure donor-recipient logic, in implementing this new global framework for sustainable development. This also refers to financing. We have to find new ways and means other than official development assistance, ODA, to lever funds for sustainable development. This requires new partnerships and instruments, in the first place to be found in the private sector. I will come back to this. So, ladies and gentlemen, at this International Disaster and Risk Conference, I assume I will not need to convince you of the importance of disaster risk reduction, DRR, for poverty reduction and sustainable development. We all know that disasters have a devastating impact on development. They threaten human life, people's health, livelihood, and security. Families lose homes, livelihoods, and loved ones. Children, and particularly girls, miss school, impacting the development opportunities of a whole generation. The poor, women and girls, disabled people, and other marginalized groups are particularly vulnerable to disasters. As a likely result of disasters, the economic basis for small businesses models breaks away, thus interrupting hard-won development progress. Disasters also reduce human capital as a result of death, injuries, long-term trauma suffered by affected individuals. They can also heavily impact ecosystem dynamics and lead to the degradation of important ecosystem services. In sum, disasters constitute a considerable drawback for development and make sustainable development impossible. A quick look at the statistics confirms that disasters have a devastating impact on sustainable development. Losses due to disasters have dramatically increased since the 1950s. Today, economic damage amounts to about $150 billion per year. Approximately 250 million persons and their livelihoods are affected by floods, storms, droughts, or earthquakes every year. Unaccounted in these figures are the many small to mid-scale disasters, which neither made their way in any statistics nor in any media coverage, but nevertheless affect life and livelihoods. In contrast to increasing losses, statistics show a considerable decrease in fatalities in the last 30 years. Nowadays, the average death toll stays at about 100,000 persons per year, sudden onset disasters, but with very high variability. While in 2012 we had only few devastating disasters, and with 14,000 deaths, a relatively low number of victims, the death toll 2 years earlier in 2010 reached nearly 300,000, mainly due to the devastating earthquake in Haiti. It has to be noted that the effects of slow onset disasters, like drought, environmental degradation, etc., are not represented in this figure. Science and statistics have the advantage that they do not only tell us something about the past, but to allow us to make projections regarding the future. Two major trends can be identified for the future regarding the frequency of disasters and the exposure and vulnerability of assets and people to these disasters. Firstly, while the frequency of natural hazards like earthquakes, earthquakes, tsunamis, or volcanic eruptions has hardly changed over time, a clear increase in weather-related disasters can be observed. The ICPP Special Report on Managing the Risks of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation points out that a changing climate leads to changes in the frequency, intensity, spatial extent, duration, and timing of weather and climate extremes, and can result in unprecedented extremes. In particular, the frequency of hazardous events like storms, floods, prolonged droughts, pests is expected to increase in the future. Secondly, while an increase in frequency of extreme events receives much attention, the report also underlines a second, equally important trend: an increasing exposure and vulnerability of people and economic assets. This increasing exposure has been the major cause of long-term increase in economic losses from weather and climate-related disasters. The exposure and vulnerability to such events, especially for vulnerable groups, is further exacerbated by factors such as ongoing population growth, unplanned urbanization, lack of or non-compliance with building codes, inequality, environmental degradation, and, last but not least, increasing poverty. Currently, the economic losses due to disasters are doubling every decade. These trends demand early action, and this, in turn, implies that we have to reduce disaster risks and build resilience. To reduce existing risks and prevent the buildup of new risks, the root causes of disasters and disaster losses must be tackled. Such measures include the management of natural resources, land use, and land management considerations, maintenance and protection of critical infrastructures, or financial issues. Socioeconomic factors, including poverty, are often at the source of disaster risks. Let me give you some examples. The uncoordinated development of human settlements and the disregard of construction standards increase the exposure of people and assets to disasters. The increased exposure due to unsustainable local development patterns is further aggravated by global developments. And if we do not overcome the carbon dioxide-intensive development path of the world economy, climate change will be further accelerated, triggering more extreme weather events. The reduction of vulnerabilities and the building of resilience is another crucial element for sustainable development. Resilience building strengthens the ability of a system, be it an individual, a household, a community, or a state, to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of shocks and stresses in a timely and efficient manner. The reduction of economic, environmental, and social vulnerabilities and the improvement of respective coping capacities contribute to the overall resilience of societies. Ladies and gentlemen, I know these are no news for you, but I mention all this in order to highlight the interlinkages between sustainable development, poverty reduction, and disaster risk reduction. They are evident. Nevertheless, it took a long time until DRR gained the necessary political attention in the development community and beyond. The Millennium Development Goals had no reference to DRR, even though the international community recognized the importance of DRR in the Millennium Declaration and resolved to intensify cooperation to reduce the number and effects of natural and man-made disasters, as well as to protect vulnerable groups. But fortunately, things have evolved in the past decade, and disaster risk reduction has become a prominent issue beyond the humanitarian sector, from where it emerged. This development also represents a shift from a response-only approach towards an integrated risk management with a strong prevention component. One important milestone in this process was, of course, the adoption of the Hyogo Framework for Action, during the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in January 2005, which you certainly know much better than I do. This conference took place only a few days after the devastating Indian Ocean earthquake and subsequent tsunamis, something that without doubt increased global awareness for DRR. During the MDG Review Summit in 2010, DRR was acknowledged as an important issue for poverty reduction and sustainable development. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon himself stated that, I quote the citation I already showed in the beginning, reducing disaster risk and increasing resilience to natural hazards in different development sectors can have a multiplier effect and accelerate achievement of the MDGs. So the importance of DRR for sustainable development was also recognized in the other process that merges with the MDGs in the post-2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Rio Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Rio +20 outcome document, entitled The Future We Want, highlights the importance of addressing DRR and the building of resilience to disasters in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. Ladies and gentlemen, the trends and numbers mentioned earlier leave no doubt that DRR and increasing resilience will be a growing challenge for all countries in the next decades. Thanks to the fact that in the past years, the issue is more and more integrated in development policy, the time is right now to anchor DRR also in the future post-2015 agenda on sustainable development. Since the beginning of the process to elaborate this agenda, Switzerland therefore actively advocates for a prominent integration of DRR in the SDGs. It is necessary that DRR is rightly perceived as contributing to the achievement of these goals. Based on Switzerland's active engagement and experience in DRR both at national and international level, the Federal Council defined DRR as a key issue for Switzerland in this post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. The Swiss position is based on the integrated risk management approach, practiced in Switzerland already for many years. Integrated risk management tackles all phases of the risk cycle, namely preparedness, response, and recovery. And it includes all stakeholders. For an effective disaster risk management, national and local governments, civil protection and fire brigades, the private sector, academia, and local communities have to work together. Given that disaster risk reduction requires a holistic and multi-sectorial approach, Switzerland advocates for a transversal integration of DRR-related targets in all relevant sustainable development goals. We consider that DRR targets are of particular relevance for goals on, for example, water, infrastructure, cities, agriculture, and ecosystems. We believe that the following elements should be reflected in the post-2015 agenda on sustainable development. Reduce the exposure and build resilience to disasters. Reduce existing and prevent the creation of new risks. Strengthen capacities and governance structures. Promote holistic and integrative risk management approaches. And in this context, Switzerland also promotes a closer collaboration of state and non-state actors for the implementation of the new agenda. Disaster risk reduction is a very good example for how the private sector is already contributing to sustainable development, namely the insurance and finance sector. Insurances are an important instrument to transfer risks and to build resilience. The task is now to make them accessible to all people, including the poor. As you might have heard, the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, which was mandated to elaborate a proposal for SDGs and targets, adopted its report last month. Thanks to the effort of Switzerland and many like-minded countries, we could successfully anchor DRR in the proposed SDGs. Let me shortly highlight the most important elements here. There is a goal on ending poverty, Goal 1. In this goal, we can find a target on building resilience of the poor and those of vulnerable situations. This target also highlights the need to reduce the exposure of poor and vulnerable groups to disasters. In Goal 2, on hunger, nutrition, and sustainable agriculture, the resilience of food production systems is addressed. In Goal 9, on infrastructure, industrialization, and innovation, there is a mention of building resilient infrastructure. In Goal 11, on cities and human settlements, we have a target aiming at the reduction of the number of deaths, economic losses, and the number of people affected by disasters. And this target has a clear reference also to water-related disasters, the most economically and socially destructive of all natural disasters, as you know. And finally, in Goal 13 on climate change, there is a clear linkage to the DRR. Among other things, it calls for strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity in all countries. So, ladies and gentlemen, after these remarks about the importance of DRR for the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda, I would like to come back to what I said at the beginning, namely the unprecedented opportunity we are presented with this and next year, and the importance to strengthen international efforts on DRR within 3 closely related frameworks. This fact is not only a unique opportunity, but also a challenge. In order to ensure the maximum impact, the 3 frameworks must be coherent, mutually reinforcing, and complementing. I would like to highlight in particular the linkage between the SDGs and the new Hyogo Framework for Action, given that these 2 frameworks have the same legal status, in contrast to the new climate change regime, which will be legally binding. As I already mentioned, the post-2015 Agenda for Sustainable Development will be the overarching framework to guide national and international efforts to eradicate poverty and ensure a sustainable development for the current and future generations. In our view, the Hyogo Framework for Action, in its definition as an action plan, should be complementary. While the SDGs will define what we want to achieve, the HFA should tell the participating states how they can achieve disaster-resilient sustainable development. In our view, the HFA too can be seen as providing an important toolbox for implementing SDGs. We consider that 3 things are important to ensure that the SDGs and the HFA too are mutually reinforcing. First of all, we need to ensure that the targets of both frameworks are aligned. Ideally, the DRR-related targets of the SDGs should be reflected also in the HFA too. This would allow that the implementation of the new Hyogo Framework for Action contributes to the achievement of the SDG targets. Second, an alignment of the monitoring mechanisms is critical. While a strong monitoring and accountability mechanism is crucial for the success of both agendas, the burden of reporting is often perceived as very high. It is therefore in the interest of all of us to organize the monitoring mechanisms of both agendas in such a way that the reporting burden for countries is kept as low as possible. The first and the second point require that the 2 frameworks have the same time horizon. And the third issue of importance for coherence between the 2 frameworks is related to the process. And as such, this issue is probably a prerequisite for the other 2 points. The HFA and the SDGs are elaborated by 2 different communities with different priorities and different histories. Representatives from the same member state often work for different ministries or divisions. The fact that the HFA2 will be adopted before the SDGs can complicate things further, especially if the 2 processes operate in isolation. Therefore, dear ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with the following message. Coherent and mutually reinforcing frameworks for both sustainable development and disaster risk reduction are in the interest of all of us. To achieve our common goal, it is indispensable to ensure that in the current elaboration process, both communities talk to each other. And it is in this sense and spirit that I thank you very much for your attention and the opportunity to present the SDGs to you, an audience that is above all engaged with the post-2015 framework for DRR. So I wish you all the best for this conference and for your invaluable engagement to make the world more resilient and sustainable. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gerber, for this excellent overview, remembering us that we have to keep the big picture in mind, and that we have to think about the alignment of the different initiatives, the alignments of the post-2015 framework for DRR, but of course, in particular, to keep in mind the umbrella, which is called sustainable development and the respective goals. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gerber, for providing us with this bigger picture. And there is time for 2 very short questions. Ambassador Gerber is ready to answer questions, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, we only can allow 2. Are there pressing questions? Okay. Please address yourself and then be short with the question.
Yes. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. There is a very great question for me, and that is how we can translate all these targets and all these policies to the governments. The more you have concentrated policy planning, the less we can translate these goals to be carried out in the development plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this very important question. Of course, with regard to implementation of these new frameworks, it is indeed crucial to make the targets be responsive and effective also at national level. And while defining a global agenda now at the normative level and the HFA2, these questions might be lost in negotiations, and it is very important that we keep in mind that we are formulating and defining goals and targets which have to be implemented in the end, also at national and local level. For the SDGs, I can only say that this process has already started to also cover questions with regard to implementation. And it will be such the case that national governments will define national strategies on sustainable development, at least this is the idea. But since this framework is not legally binding, there is a lot of flexibility, of course, for countries too. But targets have to be formulated in a way that they are to be implemented also at the national context. And I believe that the HFA2 framework will be a much more direct and straightforward framework in this regard, since it is an action plan. And if we can really make it and synthesize or link these different frameworks, these global frameworks, it will be, at least that's my wish, and I'm also quite optimistic, it will be possible to translate global goals to targets and to national implementation measures.
One additional question. Yes, please, Professor Ren.
Yeah, Ortwin Wren. I was very intrigued when you said you would like to have these different communities work more together and that you will find a more common agenda for putting poverty, climate change, and natural disasters communities together. My concern a little bit is that we create more and more committees, and these committees do more and more time of making all kinds of arrangements and specifically all kinds of documents. Are you confident that this creation of always more committees really help to get these communities together, or that it's another way of trying to make sure that we talk about it, but that there's not enough implementation in terms of policy making?
Thank you. Yeah, this is also an important concern, of course. But I think there are different ways to address this challenge. I think the one starts already with the implementation, or no, let's say the formulation of these goals or national positions for this process. In our case, for instance, at the Swiss Development Agency, we have a straightforward contact and exchange with the people that are negotiating HFA2. And so we are in a constant contact, and we exchange, of course, also our views. And we also come forward with the same positions on the linking of these different frameworks once we go into negotiations of these specific frameworks. But of course, there is also a risk, or maybe sometimes also an opportunity, to create more committees. And there is, I think, the idea in the air of a cross-framework working group to be established. And we are quite in favor of such a group, as long as it is not another committee that discusses in the air and that has no straight or direct link to the negotiation reality, etc. But as long as we can really balance these interests, I think it could be an opportunity, but it doesn't really have to be. I think it's up to nations which are engaged in these areas. I think here we can also learn from private sector actors which have more efficient setup. But I share your view, it is a risk.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gerber.